focus on maybe next.
Hey friends. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Josh Halpern. Before coming to PCC, Josh was a filmmaker and was and is still deeply involved in food justice issues. Last time we were here, after a very heady week, Josh gave a presentation where by the end of it, we were all huddled together in this nest of human limbs right here, being bathed by gorgeous images. And as I was reflecting on that, it made me realize that part of Josh's calling seems to be to point to that form of nested homeness. But that at the same time, he actually embodies that. That's a role that he plays, at least in my life, of being that nest, being that home that just draws me into the deliciousness of snuggles and delight and warmth. So I'm so excited to see what version of that we'll get to taste today. And then lastly, I just want to say that a few weeks ago, he and I sat in the truck that he uses to deliver honey to farmers markets, and we had just a delightful conversation. And there again, I realized that you are carting honey around and delivering it to people, but you are also the honey truck of this community. So please welcome Josh Halpern.
Thanks, everyone. So the title of my talk is Who Thinks We're Fucked? So show of hands. Okay, well, we can work that through a little bit. I'm going to start with a song. I'm going to go through a few things that are hard to let go of for me, and so I want to kind of bring those forth to see how everybody's doing with that. And we'll have a little bit of chance to share some of our experiences with dread and delight. And you're welcome to dance while the song goes. You're also welcome to tune into your own senses of dread and delight. I can give you an easy dread one. We're leaving Esalen tomorrow. We're going to be driving down that road, and Cell Range will come back on, and we'll have to find out about the latest. No. I'm saying couple of things. We're going to, as we get closer to the bay, there's going to be smoke. We have to find out how close the fires are to where we live. And at the same time, there's still delight. We still have a Halloween party. We're still able to go down to the baths. We're still able to be together. So I'll start the song. The song is called Do You Think We're Fucked? And then we'll get into some of the more details around that. So something like this. Yeah, I got a little drum thing over there, yeah. Okay. Let's see. fuck think? Where do you fuck think? Knowing what you know of storm, the size of hemispheres, entire forests on fire, of right here ruined, rotting from deluge or dry out, so die. Do you know me included? Why don't you believe we're will you ever believe we're what systems are so stable they will save us? What ways are you imagining in your knowing what you knew once of money, death, I forget what oh yeah, how could I forget my supplies of tortured creatures, slaughtered, shipped and salted for my sandwiches? Why don't you believe we're we stopped wanting kids. We forgot the rest of them. But we know what you did. Who's close to surrender, my friend? Realize we're very, 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 very close. Very, 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 very close. But it doesn't matter what I think. What do you guys think? Fuck? Not fuck? Not fuck? Not fuck, okay. Right, halfway. Okay, a little bit of some, let's both and. Fuck, think, well. I will put this on. Tuck it into my skirt. There we go. Okay, how's that? Excellent. All right. So, as Ari said, my focus while I was at PCC had a lot to do with home and how our homes are transforming. And that's a good entryway into talking about the climate crisis and everything that's changing, because we all have homes, we all see that there are changes taking place. I wanted to go through a few things today that are maybe important to try to let go of. And I know that's one of my tasks in this lifetime. I'm a pretty holder on to her. I don't think I need to spend any time on the climate data or trying to convince anybody here that there's major shifts. The science keeps coming back that things are worse and sooner. When I started PCC in 2010, we were talking about this is the last decade that we have left to turn things around, and the decade is 2 months done tomorrow. All the talks about like 2030 and we have 12 years, I think that's overly optimistic. I also think like people who are on the near-term human extinction track, I think that's overly optimistic. I think maybe they're rooting for that a little bit. I think we're more of a resilient and persistent species. But there are tipping points that we've already blown through. There are multiplier effects. And I in a previous version of this talk, I listed a lot of the tragedies that are ongoing. And I'm not going to do that today for the sake of time, though. We might go just a couple minutes over. I tried to time it right, but if you guys need to go to lunch, feel free. When you need to, take care of your bodies. But I'll offer Donna Haraway, who's an ecofeminist professor. She makes an important distinction on who do we include in this generation on the planet, and she refers to the born ones and the disappeared. And so the born ones are us. The born ones are this sort of population explosion after World War II. They're all the mass of pets that have come into the world. The mass of there's 6 chickens for every human on the planet now, and then the immiseration of the poor, the vast expanding into every corner of the world, and then the disappeared. Those who didn't make it, the people who were lost to genocide, the people who were going extinct. And so I just want to pause for a moment for them to acknowledge the disappeared and the disappearing. I'm going to be using, I heard it from Carolyn Casey. She has a great way of sort of using a cauldron where we offer up something that's no longer serving us and then ladle out something that might be beneficial. This is going to be our cauldron today. And I have a few things that I can pass out, and you guys can pass them along, and when you're done holding them, you may offer them into our little cauldron. So there's a little bit of kind of passing things along. The first one I want to offer up is urgency. So I'm going to hand out this goblet of ice, and if anybody wants to hold an ice cube, you're welcome to. If you don't, that's all good. But I figured I would use ice cube. Take an ice cube and pass it along. As an obvious symbol of urgency, just because it melts and the ice caps are melting, and we've already established enough melting ice caps by the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere that the seas are going to rise for thousands of years already, even if we stop what we're doing today. I'm going to read a Greta Thunberg quote, which you may have heard some of. We owe it, she keeps hearing adults saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. She says, I was so frustrated that nothing was being done about the climate crisis, and I felt like I had to do something, anything, and sometimes not doing things, like just sitting down outside the parliament, speaks much louder than doing things. Just like a whisper sometimes is louder than shouting. So I imagine it's easy for us in this room to get to urgency. There's probably a lot of things that we agree on as being urgent. And also we're absolutely allowed to have our own primary urgencies and emergencies around healthcare, income, interpersonal relationships, all the things that make life dynamic and important, and those are important. And they're also not disconnected from the larger scales of what's happening on the planet. But even when these major events hit close to home, like when my mother's city is hit by a hurricane, or when there's smoke blanketing our region from fires nearby, it's the developing way, the pattern of monitoring urgency seems to come down to questions like, well, is my mom's building okay? Or is my house on fire? And then we sort of make jokes about sweeping the forest to help the forest fires, and then move on to back to our primary urgencies. And so I want to ask the question, whose urgency affects whose agency? A good example of this is happening right outside in the huge kelp forests down below us in the ocean, because they are being depleted rapidly because of sea urchins. Because I believe the starfish who were eating the sea urchins, they got wiped out, and so now these sea urchins are proliferating and eating all the kelp forests. And so one suggestion is that we need to be eating more sea urchins. And let's say I am really into that idea, and I'm like, the urgent sea urchins, urgency of sea urchins, and like, because I'm a white guy, can divert a bunch of resources to the sea urchins. Does that mean that those resources are being taken away from somebody else? Of course it does. So those kinds of questions where Tema Okun from Showing Up for Racial Justice lists urgency as a characteristic assumption of white supremacy culture. Bayo Okomolafe from the Emergence Network, he's got a great quote here. He says, "It is not only bodies that melt into other bodies in the Anthropocene, time itself is shorn of its noble disinterestedness, and the past and future touch each other. In fact, the Anthropocene does something queer and perverse to space-time, upsetting its presumed linearity and unidirectionality, making the past contemporaneous with the present, and resituating the future with the present and the past in the thick now." And he also talks about offering an invitation to slow down, that even though it seems like that's the wrong thing to do when there's fire on the mountain, hurrying up all the time, we often lose sight of the abundance of resources that might help us in situations like that. So I don't know where the ice ended up, but whoever doesn't want to have the ice in your hands, you can put it into this. Oh, is it all melted now? See, that's what I'm saying. It's all urgent. So what would we, if we are offering up urgency, what would we ladle out? Any ideas? Trust, yeah, trust. I was going with equanimity. Yeah.
I was going with soup.
Soup. Yummy urgency soup. Yeah, those are all really good. The next one I wanted to offer up to our cauldron is efficacy. I know a lot of us are concerned about how to be effective, and of course we are. But in fact, you can never know what's effective or not effective. You have to, at some point, let go of the expectation that you can be effective. Joanna Macy talks about active hope is something you do, not something that you have. And she says, don't believe anyone who tells you how it'll turn out. It's in our not knowing that we are most in touch with our compassion and our interconnectedness. Isn't that so? Is how she says. And a quote from Pema Chodron, we don't set out to save the world, we set out to wonder how other people are doing and to reflect on how our actions affect other people's hearts, which I thought was a pretty fundamental way of approaching all of those. So it's about scales, it's about ripples. There's all these ways that we privilege large-scale effectiveness, but in fact, like just a person, a grandmother gardening and sort of cultivating food and keeping those ways alive, that has ways of rippling out. So I'm gonna offer acorns, and then also I made some acorns, like I roasted them, along with bay laurel nuts. So I'm gonna pass those around, and you can have one if you want to eat it. The acorn that you can eat looks like that. It's from this. It's from inside that guy. These are coastal live oak acorns. And then the bay laurel nut looks like that. You have to kind of break it open. There's a few that are already open, but be careful if you break it open because it can kind of like splinter a little bit. But there you go. The bay nut has caffeine a little bit. And when you roast it, it has a chocolatey coffee taste. And just saying, if we run out of chocolate, because chocolate can only grow in a few places in the world right now, and if it goes extinct, which it could if we keep taking all the chocolate and for feeding our chocolate habits, which I'm certainly guilty of, the bay nut might become the closest approximation that we have locally to that kind of chocolate flavor. Yeah, so if we're putting in efficacy, we might ladle out surrender. You know, and that's one that we can keep practicing all the time, right? Finally, in terms of what we're gonna offer up, safety, which is a tough one. And I'll talk about deserving in a moment, but a minute for our safety symbol, I'm offering some rosemary, which I plucked from my school garden. It's the original name for rosemary is, you can take a little sprig or you can break off a little rosemary needle and eat it if you want. You can put it back in the cauldron if you want. It was originally called dew of the sea. That's what rosemary means. And the original grandma rosemaries were these huge, much larger than a human plants clinging to the cliffs in the Mediterranean, just feeding on the mist coming off the sea. And that seems like a pretty precarious safety. But, I'll give an example of, I had this story where my feeling is, you can let me know if you relate to this, I had this feeling like, okay, in previous generations, there's some understandable, like, you can retreat to the woods, you can not participate, you can just have a sweet life. And it feels like, well, in this life, it seems pretty important to show up. I also want to mention showing up is an ableist phrase. I really like the idea of showing up, but there's also people who can't show up. And we don't want to exclude them just because today they're not able to show up because they're in pain or, they're having a hard time for whatever reason. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I was mentioning this story about like getting to a place where we can't do that anymore. We can't go off to the woods, not only because we should show up, we have this little window of time to make a difference, this is the time to act, but then also, there's not really anywhere that's safe. The woods are all burning. You think you're gonna go up to Alaska and tuck in? Well, the tundra's on fire and all that. And so I was talking about this at the honey stand with a friend of mine, and he's like, that sounds like a white person problem. Because I'm assuming that I have some expectation of safety. And that's not the case in a large part of the world. It's not the case ever, really. I think safety, another reason I chose rosemary is because it has often symbolized memory and like I think safety has a lot to do with safe experiences that you've had in the past and the expectation of safety in the future. But that doesn't actually add up to safety. Some people are addicted to adrenaline and they feel safe when they're going really fast. And I'm not that way. But both of us would feel safe in different circumstances. So there's so much I could talk about all this, but I'm just touching on it for a moment. It also gets into solastalgia, which is one of the focuses of my work back at CIIS, which is the homesickness that shows up as your home disappears around you. I'll also mention there are ways that you can prepare for things like fire, like having a bug out bag, setting up outdoor sprinklers. There's like practical ways, and that also can help you combat like pre-TSD, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of weaponizing of dread in the world by the powers that be. And sort of projecting ruin on the cities. There's all these movies that came out in the last 10 years of San Francisco being destroyed by various tsunamis and monsters and all that stuff. So if you really want to imagine a diabolical, imminent disaster, it's really easy to do that. And so what does that allow for? And then also you have movements like Black Lives Matter, which is fundamentally about safety and establishing safety together and not pretending like nothing's going wrong, but actually, and then that's part of men unlearning rape culture and dominance and ownership over anyone else's body. There's ways that we need to establish safety together, but that's an ongoing process, and it's not something that you can assume. So if you're letting go of your old expectations of safety, maybe you would ladle out of the cauldron solidarity, right? I'll just speak real quickly about deserving and entitlement, and a little bit about avoidance, and a little bit about self-care and sacrifice, and then we'll get into small groups for 5 minutes, and then we'll be done. Deserving and entitlement. So there's this feeling, I have these conversations with my mom about she would really like grandkids. And there's a heartbreak there around, I would love that for you too. And also it's a really complicated decision right now. And not for, it's all for us to make personally, of course, and with our partners. But there's this sense of, don't kids deserve a safe place to grow up? And then there's also a sense of, has the world ever been a safe place to grow up? There's been kids showing up in the world through all the wars and all the plagues and all the various histories that have seemed like the world is ending. This is a little bit more. It's a much like the functioning life system of the planet is a scale that we haven't really confronted yet. But I'll read this Ursula K. Le Guin quote. For we, each of us, deserve everything, every luxury that was ever piled in the tombs of the dead kings, and we each of us deserve nothing, not a mouthful of bread in hunger. Have we not eaten while another has starved? Will you punish us for that? Will you reward us for the virtue of starving while others ate? No one deserves punishment. No one deserves reward. Free your mind from the idea of deserving, and you'll begin to be able to think freely. I think with avoidance, which I sometimes spell as avoid dance, that's a really understandable response. And all of the intense feelings that come up around these things, despair, rage, all of those are healthy responses to what's happening. In terms of avoidance, I'll use this Audre Lorde quote. She describes her daughter saying, "Tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent. Because there's always that one little piece inside of you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter and hotter. And if you don't speak out, one day it'll just up and punch you in the mouth from the inside." And she says, "What I regretted most were my silences. Death is the final silence. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you." So some of my strategy around that is to kind of slow down, as we were saying, and notice where that kind of avoidant attachment exists in my body. Where does it show up in your tissues, in your fascia? Where does it linger after you do avoid? Or what happens to it when you make the choice to just do the small, bite-sized step now that's possible? In my case, it's kind of like right next to me, being like, too little, too late. And then it's like, okay, well, that's worth nights, and I shouldn't do anything because it's too little, too late. But I have to kind of continually be in dialogue with that part of myself. I'll just talk quickly. There's like a hashtag self-care movement, And that comes out of Audre Lorde's quote from 1988, which is, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation," and that is an act of political warfare. And there's a history there, starting with, like, in philosophy, the start might be Socrates, who advised a young man not to attempt political leadership until he has attended to himself. But then the self-cultivated individual was used to qualify or disqualify for full citizenship. It was used to justify slavery. It was used to argue against women's suffrage, food stamps. It means they're lazy, right, if they're not sort of showing up. But then that also means they have to perform that. It's not just about self-care. They have to do it in a way that counts. And now it's turned into this multi-billion-dollar industry where you get mindfulness and wellness and optimizing your self-care through hacks, and follow the self-care bot who will give you hourly optimistic tweet, affirmations, right? I got some self-care stickers here somewhere, but I'll pass them out. So I think we can witness and honor each other's unique vulnerabilities to the extent that we're able to honor our own, but the danger becomes focusing solely on personal work and neglecting the systemic oppressions that cause harm. And Adrienne Marie Brown also reminds us to lift up disabled and chronically ill folk, because they invented the art of collective self-care. They couldn't rely on the medical system. They couldn't rely on people to understand how they were in need, so they had to show up for themselves. And I'll just say, in terms of sacrifice, we are clearly broadcasting our willingness to sacrifice children to detention camps, to gun violence, to an uninhabitable future, where too many places will be too hot to grow food, called sacrifice zones. And how can we be expected to sacrifice ourselves? There's the anti-civilization folks who say the faster that we tear down the dominant extractive economy and basically all of civilization, the faster the rest of the biosphere can rebound. That's a hard choice. If we're being suicidal, can we already, it doesn't make sense to sort of act on that, like make it official. That's not psychologically available for most of us, because we all have some drive and will to live, to keep going. And would you tell the last blade of grass alive on the planet that it's not deserving of its own share of light and soil and water? Just tell it to give up. There's also questions of atonement and forgiveness, and Vine Deloria, who's a Standing Rock Sioux theologian and historian, talks about how Western concepts of forgiveness and repentance for sin don't actually get into what's important in terms of responsibility and gifting. To Lewis Hyde, who wrote The Gift, reminds us that to atone is to reunite, to make at one. And there was a time when a criminal was allowed and expected to atone for his crime with a gift. Sometimes the gift is engagement, sometimes it's space from the community. So what helps? I have had the privilege of being able to set up my life where I'm not hustling all the time. I can be present with the seasons as a garden teacher. I can be present with what blooms at different times of the year as a beekeeper and working with the bees. And I offer watershed tours. So when I started that, we were at the bottom of the drought in 2015, and we've blessedly also been able to have rains here, so that now all the reservoirs and the aquifers are pretty full. But it's about witnessing each year, getting to know it back again and again, and also being aware of the reasons we have rain is because things like El Nino brought that moisture from places like Cape Town and Australia, places that are in drought right now, because it's all connected that way. So there's two questions I wanted you to ask, if you can pair off. First one is, because we're getting into the 2020, and we're trying to imagine what 2020 and the 2020s are like. Also, that would be a great band name, by the way. I was picturing what my 2020 self would tell my 2010 self. And there's so much that I would want to explain, and then I figured my 2010 self would have questions around what are the repercussions of all this? Who's taking responsibility? How are we learning how to share with each other? So I wanted to have an imagining around what your 2030 self would tell your 2020 self about responsibility or about sharing, about respect, and about love. And then my second question is, what gives you reassurance? Who in your life or what in your life allows you to believe in a livable future? So if we could just take 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute for each, if you're able to pair off, and just kind of imagine both what your 2030 self might tell your 2020 self. It could be that no, we're all dead. I mean, or it could be, we worked it out, and we locked up all the CEOs who were destroying the planet, and we are replenishing everything. So just take a moment to do that for 1 minute, okay? Just give each other a little bit of imagining. Okay, so second question is, who in your life or what in your life, is there anything in your life that makes you believe in a livable future? Because there's tons of things that make you believe that things are not going to work out. But what in your life or who in your life do you notice does make you believe that we can make it to elderhood, that we are going to be able to have a future in this world? Okay, go. The second question? What gives you the belief in a livable future, or who gives you the belief in a livable future? Okay. All right, guys. So with our last minute together before lunch, and aren't we grateful that we still have lunch and each other and all that? That's one of them for me, for sure. Anybody want to share anything that you just shared with each other? Say what you just said. Here.
What was I saying? I was just saying something about how art and beauty give me hope. Mm-hmm. And that we can appreciate those things together, and that they bring us together.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Kind of works.
Josh, just a quick tweet of affirmation for you. I think holding the grief, making space for the grief in the way that you do, while also making space for humor. I think laughing and crying is exactly how we process the trauma of this moment. And thank you for inviting us into that.
I also, speaking of that, sure. I'll just, a quick note that I wanted to bring up last time when we were talking about trees communicating. There's a study of a little baby saplings, of one playing a practical joke on the other saplings, where this little sapling was like, uh-oh, there's something coming, it's a bug. Send out your anti-bug, chemical. And then the other one's like, oh, and then they do that, and then the first one's like, ha ha ha, just kidding. And they were able to measure that. So laughter, I can find you the guys that study, but laughter seems fundamental to the universe, right? Yeah, fundamental medicine for us. Yeah.
I just, this community and this program specifically gives me a lot of hope when we get to come together and meet with current students and alumni and see what everybody's sharing. And I think just the fact that it exists and 25 years in, and I just feel that it's really important, and being surrounded by these ideas and people doing work out in the world and being with the world and listening gives me a lot of hope.
Anybody else? Jonesy?
So I actually recently did a drum journey to meet my elder self, and she was very happy and very, like, had seen a lot, but there was inner light. And I think what she was trying to communicate to me in this time was that there is such joy and such beauty and such magic in the midst of whatever chaos there is, that there is also divine beauty to be co-present with everything. And that was stunning to me, because I can tell you I'm not in a happy place, and yet I feel that joy, I feel the love, I feel the compassion that's also present. So
Thanks. I'll end by saying
Can I add one thing, Josh?
oh yeah, Chet, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say first that John echoed what Matt said about comedy and laughter.
Yeah.
Hold space that way, it's crucial. And then I was reflecting to John how I have a deep trust and faith in the cosmos because of the astrological perspective. It indicates that the universe is deeply in love with every person on the planet. Your birth chart reflects how you are cared for and have the opportunity to develop a relationship with the intelligence in the universe. It's an actual ongoing relationship that we can develop, and the universe would not go through the trouble to make this happen if it did not want us to succeed. So I have a deep faith that whatever is happening at all these levels, that the universe underneath is supportive.
Yeah, I believe that too. Yeah, I've done a little bit of, like, Joanna Macy does the sort of seventh generations meditation, and the thing that seemed to me when I did that to connect the past and the present and the future, the image that I got was of like dirty hands, like up close soil, stained hands, because that's something that we have in common. It's something that we can be that intimate, we can be that close to each other. And I'll end with a Adrienne Marie Brown quote, whose most recent book is Pleasure Activism, which I definitely recommend. And she talks about that this is what we learn from flocking. There's another quote about being in solidarity with the migrant, with the displaced and dispossessed, and that's going to be a big issue this century. But this is about what you learn from flocking, how to stay the right distance apart and the right distance in touch with each other in order to actually move together and stay alive and make it as far as we can. So, yeah. Music. Yeah. Thanks.